You ever wonder what's really important or grapple with what's really important? I'm 51 years old. Both of my parents are deceased. My mom passed away about 5 years ago. It's hard to believe. And I don't know about you if you've ever lost a parent, but it was a kind of a weird feeling when my mom died. My dad had died 12 years prior to that. And it was like the last two people on the planet that loved me unconditionally, besides the dog that I used to have that died, was gone. And when she was dying of cancer in the hospital, in and out of the hospital the last 3 years of her life, I had a tough time with it. As my youngest daughter moved out of the house 3 years ago, and we started experiencing the empty nest, I had a really difficult time with it. I still kind of have a difficult time with it. And at 51 years old, I don't think the way that I used to think at 40 or at 30 or at 20. I remember my mom and dad saying that the older they got, the more people they knew died. And it was like one funeral after another funeral after another funeral. And I'm starting to experience that in my life, and I don't really like it very much. But one thing that it has done, it has pressed me up against looking at what's really important. What is really important in life? Because I want to submit to you that we make a lot of things that are not really important be important, a lot more important than they really are. And we're going to see really what's really important in this first passage that we're going to look at, where a guy comes up and asks Jesus a question. And so let's just go there. It's in Mark chapter 12, verse 29 through 31. And one of the scribes asked him, "What commandment is foremost of all?" What's most important, Jesus? And Jesus answered, and he says, "The foremost is, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. The second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself." That's it. Right there, with those two commandments, he's basically summarizing all of the commandments. All of the commandments can be wrapped up into those two, love God and love others. If you think of the 10 commandments, the first 4 have to do with your relationship with God, and 5 through 10 have to do with your relationship with other people. If you love God, you will automatically obey the first 4. If you love your neighbor or others, you will obey the next 6. In other words, love is the fulfillment of the law. All of God's commandments can be simplified and summarized into these 2. You want to know what really the real purpose of life is? There it is. Love God and love others. When my mom was dying and she knew that she was going to finally die, I can promise you that there was nothing else more important than where she was going to go when she closed her eyes and her relationships with the people that she loved. That she wanted them near, and she wanted to know if she was going to go to heaven when she died. As a matter of fact, they put a trach in, which she was against, but they thought they were going to be able to revive her and get her better before they realized that it was a lot worse than they thought. But when she had the trach in at the very end, the day before she died, she couldn't talk, so we put a pad in her hand. And one of the questions that she wrote on the pad when I was in the room alone with her is, "Do you think I'll go to heaven?" Now, you got to understand, my mom grew up in a traditional religion, and even though she understood and believed the gospel, she had a hard time believing that she was good enough or that God's grace was sufficient. And so when she wrote that question, I said, "Mom, you remember all the conversations?" Because we had had many, okay, and all the tapes you listened to and all this. And we had just had a conversation the prior week, again, explained the gospel to her, asked her where she was, if she felt like she was okay, and all of that. And she nodded, and I said, "Mom, let me pray for you." And I grabbed her hand, and I just began to weep. I just began to weep uncontrollably. And the thing that kept coming up for me to pray for her is, God, just give her the assurance of her salvation. Just give her the assurance of her salvation. And she patted me on the head, and it wasn't long after that we convinced the doctor to take the trach out, which was her wishes, and they gave her morphine, and she gradually, slowly, she was conscious for a while, felt better. We all talked to her. Everybody was there with her, but she gradually slipped into a coma. And that night, my two sisters, even though the doctor said go home and get some rest, it may not be for a while that she dies, they insisted on staying with her. My two sisters, Yvonne and Charlotte. And they were in the beds next to her, and sometime in the middle of the night, probably 11 or 12 o'clock, my mom just goes like this. And, they thought she was gasping for air and frightened, and they calmed her down and put her arms down by her sides, and, she went back into the coma. And they kind of went back to sleep after the nurse came in and left. And then a little while later, and then they did the same thing, and she went back into the coma. And they didn't know what had happened and didn't think anything of it. And the next day, we all went in, and her breathing became more labored, and became obvious that it was time, and everybody was in there and praying for her. And I had my hands on her head, and I'm saying, Mom, it's okay. You can leave. We're all okay. Because that was the only thing she was concerned about, it was that we would all be okay. When you get to the end of your life, that's pretty much all that matters. It's not, gee, I wish I could have gone to the office one more day. Or I'm worried about my boat. Or the house note. No, you're not worried about any of that stuff. And so as we were praying for her, and I'm saying, Mom, just let go into the arms of Jesus. I could just feel the life go out of her body, and she just quietly passed from this world into the next. Well, my two sisters both committed their lives to Christ within a few months of that. Because when I got an opportunity to speak at the wake and at the funeral, I recounted all the conversations that my mom had. I recounted that she had asked me, do you think I'll go to heaven, in my prayer? And what I believe, and I don't have any doubt about it, is that what happened in the middle of the night was Jesus appeared to her and says, Putzi, that was her nickname, really Alice, it's okay. You can let go. Because people hang on at the end. And it gave me such a great sense of assurance that my mom was in the presence of the Lord. What's really important? All that's really important is loving God and loving others. Is that what's important in your life? We could talk about what all these words mean. With all your heart means the inner man, from the core of your being, and we're to love Him with all of our heart. That we're to love God with our soul, which is really your life. You ever heard your life is God's gift to you? What you do with it is your gift to God. And then with your mind, with your understanding, by seeking to know Him and His Word, so His principles and values form the foundation of all we think and do. Or with our strength, which implies force or power, making service to God and man the main purpose of your life's work. We could talk about all those words, but really the summary of all those four, what it means to love God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength, it means loving God with the totality of your being, more than any relationship, activity, achievement, or possession. And the love here, by the way, in case you haven't figured it out, is agape. We're going to talk about what agape means. It's not eros or phileo or sturgeon. It's not a feeling kind of love. It's a love that emanates from your spirit. It's true love, more than a feeling. The kind of love that sustains a relationship past the 7-year hitch, through the trials. The kind of love that we love God with, that He loves us with, that He commands us to love other people with, or even our enemies, like we talked about last week. You don't have to feel like loving. You just need to love them. By the power of His Spirit dwelling in you, you can do that. And so He says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. That's number one. Number two is you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And the Good Samaritan, that parable Jesus told, explains that our neighbor is anyone that crosses our path, basically anyone that we can see in our path that has a need. basically anybody, others. So we're to love God and love others, but you might notice there's an implied third commandment. Usually we talk about these as the two great commandments, but really there's a third one that I believe is very important that we often don't talk about, and that's to love yourself. See, because he says love God and love your neighbor as yourself. So what it means is, it could mean two things. Love your neighbor just as you love yourself. In other words, just as you love yourself, in the same way that you love yourself, love your neighbor. Wow. Or it could mean that love your neighbor as yourself, that while you're loving yourself, don't forget to love your neighbor. So what I want to do tonight is talk about these three things, these three objects of love: loving God, loving others, and loving yourself, and explain what each means to give you a better sense of how to do it, because if it's the most important thing in life, we ought to know how to do it. We ought to know what it means. And then how to balance these three things. And then next week we're going to talk about what it means to love, what it really looks like to agape. And then in the last session, I'm going to give you my 3 rules of avoiding burnout when dealing with other people. This is what has preserved the little bit of hair I have left as a counselor. Because you've got to learn to take care of yourself. You can't just take care of others at the expense of yourself, yet you're called to love others. And it's put before yourself. It kind of assumes that we already love ourselves. We don't need to be commanded to love ourselves. We need to be commanded to love God and love others. So what does it mean, first of all, to love God? There's 2 other passages that I think give us a little bit clearer picture. One, on the one hand, we have a command delivered by Moses in Deuteronomy chapter 10, verse 12 through 13. This is right as the Israelites were going in to possess the promised land, and Israel is a type of all of us. What happened to Israel happens to all of us as children of God. It's a type or a picture of what happens to us. So he could be saying this to each one of us. And he was saying it to Israel right as they went into the promised land, recalling what they had been through and telling them what they needed to do when they went in there. And in verse 12 and 13 of chapter 10, he says, "And now, Israel, what does the Lord your God require of you? But to fear the Lord your God, to walk in all of his ways and love him, and serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul." There's that phrase again. "And to keep the Lord's commandments and his statutes, which I am commanding you today for your good." Keep in mind, it's all for our good. So he says, first of all, to fear the Lord. That means to reverence him, to stand in awe of him, then to walk in all of his ways. At first I thought that meant obey his commandments, but then I looked up the word, and it actually means to imitate him, to strive to be like him, to follow as a model, to copy him, to walk in his ways, to walk like he walked. Then he says to love him, and that love there is affectionately, not agape, it's affectionately. It's a Hebrew word, and it means with your feelings, almost like a sexual, romantic kind of love, that your feelings are very much involved. To love him affectionately. And then to serve the Lord, that means to work for him with effort, to serve him, and then to keep the Lord's commandments. I thought, again, that meant obey. And what it really means is to guard, protect, and attend to his commandments. Gives us a little bit different meaning. And in point A on your outline, under love God, I want you to write in these words. Loving God means, and I think what most people would say that it means, kind of based on this scripture, without really digging deep, is it means reverence, obey, and serve him. That to love God means to reverence, obey, and serve him. And certainly all those things are true. But I don't think that's all there is. I even dug out of this passage some other things besides that. So on the one hand, we have this verse, which says reverence, obey, and serve. And on the other hand, we have this story told by John, by the disciple John, about Jesus that appears in Luke chapter 10, verse 38 through 42. One of my favorite all-time stories and pictures. And it reads this. Now, as they were traveling along, meaning Jesus and his disciples, he entered a certain village, and a woman named Martha welcomed him into her home. And she had a sister called Mary, who moreover was listening to the Lord's word, seated at his feet. But Martha was distracted by all her preparations, and she came up to him and said, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to do all the serving alone? Then tell her to help me. But the Lord answered and said to her, Martha, Martha, dear Martha Stewart, you are worried and bothered by so many things, but only a few things are necessary. Really only one. For Mary has chosen the good part, which shall not be taken away from her. Now, aren't we supposed to serve the Lord? That's what Martha was doing. Mary was plopped on the floor doing nothing, listening to Jesus. And it says that Martha was distracted with all of her preparations. You ever get like that? When people are coming over, ladies, redo the house, paint the shutters, plant the flower beds, run your poor husband ragged. She was distracted by all her preparations, and she was boudin because she was left to do it all alone. She actually had a couple of servants, but she was perturbed that Mary wasn't helping her. Because after all, they were serving the Lord and all of his disciples. What could be more important than that? But then the Lord answered when she implored him to get her to help her. He said, Martha, Martha, you are worried and bothered by so many things. What that means, worried means preoccupied, and bothered means encumbered. Meaning she was preoccupied by so many things. She was preparing a meal, but maybe she was going overboard. It wasn't sufficient that they throw, that Hela, her servant, threw the figs in a bowl. She wanted them displayed on a platter in a floral design, and then to drizzle the icing to and from ever so slightly to impress the master. So she was preoccupied by all of these things, a 7-course meal versus a 3-course meal, and she was bothered by them. Bothered means encumbered. It would be like she wore a coat, but that wasn't enough. She put 7 coats on, and she had so many things on her that she could not move. She was encumbered. She couldn't move. You ever feel like that? Like you're preoccupied and you're encumbered? You can't move because you got so many things you're worried about distracting you? And he says you're worried and bothered by so many things, but really only a few things are necessary. That's a message in and of itself. Really only a few things are necessary. What are they? That would be a good thing to ask yourself. Different message for another time. Really only a few things are necessary. Really only one. And then he says, for Mary has chosen the good part. And sorry, Martha, it's not going to be taken away from her. So, loving God means reverencing him, obeying him, and serving him. But loving God also means, point B on your outline, to receive God's love and enjoy his presence. As a scripture, 1 John 4:19, it says, we love because he first loved us. The only way that we can love him or anybody else or ourselves for that matter is that we first receive his love. Psalm 16:11, one of my favorites, the psalmist writes, thou wilt make known to me the path of life. In thy presence is fullness of joy. In thy right hand there are pleasures forever. In thy presence is fullness of joy. Have you ever experienced just being in God's presence? God is present all the time. But there are times when you can experience his presence more fully. And I believe there's nothing more important than seeking that. Sure, serving Him is important. Sure, obeying Him is important and reverencing Him is important. But you know what's more important or just as important? Letting Him love you and experiencing His presence. Because I submit to you, the more you do that, the more you're going to become like Him, the more you're going to want to become like Him. You know, as I've read this scripture over and over again about loving God and loving others, it's issued like a commandment. And that's odd to me. I guess I think about these kind of things a lot. Maybe some of you don't. But why would Jesus command us to love God? You know, if He created us in the Garden of Eden and wanted a relationship with us, He didn't want a robot or a slave. That's why He gave us a choice. Don't eat of the tree. It was, just one commandment way back then, We botched that. But He gave us a choice. It was a point of choice where I could choose to love Him and obey Him or not. He didn't want a robot or a slave. He wanted a relationship. So why now command us to love Him? Seems like He's forcing me to. What I've come to understand is that it is a process not unlike that which occurs in good parenting. Because we are prone to selfishness, going astray, and forgetting God, He raises us like a good parent would raise his child. That's why I brought this umbrella. There's 3 stages, I believe, that we go through. That I believe you'll recognize these with your own children. It's like the first stage is the lowest stage. I got a child under here with me. Can I have a volunteer? Just anybody. It doesn't matter. I'm not going to embarrass you. I just want you to stand under the umbrella with me. Alan, you knew you'd have something to do tonight. Just imagine Alan's my child, okay? And, yeah, there you go. I think I had you do that before, didn't I? And so the first stage is, Alan, you need to stay under this umbrella. See, there's an imaginary circle under here. And if you get outside of here, I'm going to whip your behind. And bad things are going to happen. You understand?
Yes, sir.
So he stays under the umbrella because of fear that bad things are going to happen if he gets outside of here. Next stage, stand up a little bit. As he grows, I hope he gets to the point where he stays under this umbrella, not just because bad things are going to happen, because he begins to see that staying under this umbrella is the best way to live, that my principles work pretty good, that this protects you from storms and whatnot. Remember, we do this all for his good. Remember the Deuteronomy verse? Then as he grows into an adult, or he matures, I would hope that he would not just stay under this umbrella because of fear of what's going to happen if he doesn't, or just because it's a good set of rules and principles to live your life by, but he would stay under here because he wants to be with me. He wants to be like me. He wants to be with me. You with me? Thank you. That's what God really wants. Don't you think? Besides being the only person in the world who knows everything about you and still loves you anyway, loves you unconditionally, and being the most intelligent, creative, powerful, and most loving person in the universe, he's the Alpha, the Omega. He's the creator, the sustainer, the Savior and Lord, the Good Shepherd, the great physician, the wonderful counselor, the way, the truth, and the life, your loving Father, your faithful friend, the lover of your soul. That's why we obey him and reverence him and serve him, not because we have to, not because bad things are going to happen, not because it works. All that's true. But ultimately, what it's really about, when it all boils down into the essence of it, it's all about a relationship. It's not about rules or religion. It's about connecting with him and having a living, vibrant relationship with that being that I just described, which I can't even describe, words cannot describe. That's what he wants. That's what it means to choose the good part. How, in practical terms, can you choose the good part? Well, have some regular connect time with God. Make it a priority. It can be praying, it can be worship, Bible study, it could be spending time in nature, solitude, reflecting, writing. It could be any number of things. You know, George Borner says that less than 10% of Christians that go to church, evangelical, church-going Christians, less than 10% have a regular devotion time with God. That means that they exist on what happens Sunday. Regurgitated food from the pastor. They don't go get the food themselves. They get the regurgitated version. They say, like the Israelites said to Moses, we don't want to hear from God anymore. You go listen to God and you come down and tell us what he says. Well, you're missing the good part. The goal would be to develop a prayer time and get in the habit of that. That evolves into a prayer life, and then that evolves into a life of prayer. What I have come to understand is that no man or woman is greater than his devotional life. Your relationships aren't working. You're not being as loving as you ought to be. It all boils down to how much time are you spending with God, really. Not because you have to, not because he'll be mad at you, but because you want to. Because your life depends on it, because it really does. And you know what they say, you miss one day alone with God, he knows it. You miss 2 days alone with God, you know it. You miss 3 days alone with God, everybody else knows it. Are you missing the good part? Don't.